But ask yourself, for instance, whether or not Barack Obama is serving George W. Bush's third term or not. Now, therefore then, voters get a narrow range of choices, and that's very far from what any ideal conception of democracy might be thought to imply. But in any case, even if the government were thoroughly democratic, there would still be the obvious problem that what's needed is to explain how some group of people, whether or not they're democratically organized, might be thought to have political authority over each other or anyone else in the first place. Political authority, that is the authority to use force in relation to each other. What exactly is supposed to give this group of people that kind of authority? Now, people often answer this question by saying that consent is what matters. But it's clear in reality that most people have not consented and can't consent to the state, and that they don't do so. And there's a good argument to be made that because they're always operating under the threat of the state's violence, there's no way they could in fact freely consent and freely signal that consent. In any event, ask yourself whether you ever actually consented to the state's authority. Ask yourself whether anyone you know actually consented to the state's authority. So I think consent is honestly a red herring here, because consent isn't much of an issue. Now, you have some folks, of course, who say, well, what matters is hypothetical consent. You should have consented, or you would have consented if you were a really wise, thoughtful person like us. That's not real consent. Now, notice the basic form the argument takes here. The argument against the state is always multi-part. It includes many dimensions. So it addresses, I think, both the question, does the state do any good, and is the state legitimate? So I think the argument then, it seems to me, against the state has to take something like the following form. It has to address all of these aspects. So first of all, the state is illegitimate. Here the concern is with the moral basis of the state's claim that people have consensually accepted its authority. And the answer is clearly they haven't. Okay, number two, it also has to be affirmed that the state is ineffective. And here the concern is with the inefficiency of the state's production and delivery of goods and services. We can make this point a priori, as I suggested earlier, by pointing out that when it comes to producing and delivering goods and distributing goods and services, people at the grassroots always have more information than the state could in principle have. And so the state just can't determine appropriate distribution patterns and production levels for goods and services. But we can also ask a posteriori what's going on here and look at the way in which the state actually performs in this area and note the obvious inefficiencies in its approach. Now, the state is destructive. Here, this is a matter of pointing to the awfulness that happens when the state is in operation and the risks of war and plunder that go along with state power. When the state has the kind of power that it does to raise taxes and deploy armies, it can do truly awful things around the world. And look at the destruction of lives and property that goes along with the state's mischief. People cooperating peacefully can do so without any stigma of illegitimacy. People don't need any legitimacy test to be passed in order just to cooperate peacefully and get along with each other and make their own plans. People cooperating peacefully can produce goods and services, including the goods of law and justice and defense, much more efficiently than the state can. And then people cooperating peacefully don't have the capacity to be destructive in ways the state can be. Now understand, I do not mean that people cooperating peacefully suddenly become benevolent without the state. I talked about this in a previous lecture. I'm not saying that somehow people without the state become inherently good. I think the mixed character of human moral motivation is just a datum with which we have to do whenever we are interested in understanding social phenomena. But it is the case that the potential for destruction is dramatically reduced when the power that any person or organized group of people might have access to is reduced. If there's less ability to deploy force, then there's less ability to do damage. So there's both a negative and a positive case to be made with regard to the state. To their credit, the Tannehills spend a lot of time in this book doing the hard work of making the positive case, of showing the availability and attractiveness of the state-free alternative. And I think that's a great thing about this book, because that's the thing that so many people really worry about. If you spell out for people the reasons why the state's claim to be based on consent don't really hold up. Most people will tend to say, yeah, that's right, I really didn't consent to the state, and these arguments that I consented to the state are frankly pretty pathetic. But they'll then go on to say, yeah, but could some alternative work? Don't I need the sword of Leviathan hanging over the head of, well, not me, but my neighbors, to keep them in line? And so, if you think that social peace and social order are dependent on the existence and operation of the state, then the question, what is the state good for, has to be answered in some detail, and that's what the Tannehills are up to in much of this book. We will continue to engage with them on this topic in Lecture 3.